Before we begin the story, if you are new to our channel, please subscribe right away, like the video, and share it with your friends so this story can reach everyone. If you want your name to be included in our upcoming story, make sure to comment your name and the place you are listening from. In our next story, we will mention your name here. So, let's move ahead with our story. Cedar Creek, North Carolina had the kind of quiet charm people only saw in postcards. The old wooden bridges, parks filled with oak trees, and a Main Street cafe where high school kids worked summer shifts while retired veterans played checkers outside. People liked to think they knew each other here. They didn't. Behind polished smiles and Sunday church services, secrets festered like mold under wallpaper. The Reynolds family, once pillars of Cedar Creek, carried one of the darkest secrets of them all. The Reynolds family. Charles Reynolds, 60, patriarch, stern, built his fortune in construction and land deals, believed power justified every cruelty. Martha Reynolds, 58, warm face but silent enabler, lived in fear of her husband's temper. Daniel Reynolds, 32, eldest son, ambitious lawyer in Charlotte, resented his father's dominance. Michael Reynolds, 28, middle son, military veteran, quieter, haunted by combat memories and unspoken scars. Emily Reynolds, 23, college dropout, rebellious spirit, closest to uncovering truths hidden inside the family. From the outside, they looked like success, but Cedar Creek whispered about late-night fights, police visits that were hushed, and cruel business practices that bankrupted neighbors. 20 years before, an accident had taken the life of Charles' younger brother, Richard. Official reports claimed Richard was drunk, his truck swerving into the creek late at night, but neighbors knew Richard had been at odds with Charles over land inheritance. Richard had accused Charles of forging documents, stealing acreage that was supposed to belong to both brothers. Then he was dead. Richard left behind a wife, Laura, and a son, Ethan, who moved away after the funeral. Most thought they'd never look back. They were wrong. In the summer of 2022, Ethan Cole, he had taken his mother's maiden name after leaving Cedar Creek, returned. At 34, tall, with sharp eyes and a quiet composure, he wasn't the boy who left. He was now a high school history teacher. But there was something more in his presence, an undercurrent of purpose. Emily saw him first at the lakeside park. She didn't recognize him, but when he introduced himself, the name hit her like thunder. Ethan Cole, my mother's Laura. Richard was my father. Emily froze. She'd heard whispers of the uncle she never knew. Her father never spoke his name. Ethan smiled politely, but there was steel behind it. I just want to reconnect with where I came from. But that wasn't true. Ethan's return wasn't about reconnecting. It was about unearthing. Over dinner, Emily cautiously asked Charles about Richard. He slammed his glass on the table. Richard was a fool. He drank himself to death. End of story. But Emily noticed her mother flinch. Daniel tighten his lips. Michael stare hard at his plate. That night, Emily searched the attic. Between boxes of old tax records and faded photographs, she found a drawer filled with legal contracts, property deeds, names blacked out, and one signature at the bottom, Richard Reynolds. Shaky, mismatched, almost forged. When she compared it to earlier letters Richard had written, she saw it wasn't the same hand. She didn't tell anyone. Not yet. While Emily uncovered papers, Ethan quietly reacquainted himself with the town, slept in the spare room of his cousin's old friend, coached Little League, smiled at shopkeepers. Everyone liked him. But in the evenings, alone in his car, he wrote in a notebook filled with years of research. Bank statements that didn't add up, old maps showing Richard's land reassigned to Charles's company, newspaper clippings of construction projects funded off sudden inheritance windfalls. What Cedar Creek didn't know was that Ethan had spent the last decade tracing every thread of his father's downfall. Now he was ready to pull them tight, one by one, until the Reynolds family unraveled. After days of trying to shake off the discovery in the attic, Emily realized she couldn't. Her heart raced each time she looked at the forged signature. She wanted to ask her mother, but feared involving her. Instead, she messaged Ethan. "Can we talk?" They met at a quiet coffee shop outside town. Ethan listened carefully as Emily described the papers. His eyes darkened. "You found the proof," he whispered. "I knew it existed. Charles stole everything from my father." Emily wanted to argue, to defend her family somehow, but deep down she knew Ethan's tone wasn't fantasy, it was conviction. Ethan leaned in, speaking with measured intensity. "My father wasn't perfect. He drank sometimes, sure, but he wasn't reckless. He'd been fighting Charles in court, over deeds, over land that was rightfully his. Days before his death, he told my mother he had evidence. Then suddenly, he's gone. Police ruled it an accident, but the truck's brake line was cut. My mother suspected, but who would listen? No one stood up against the Reynolds family." Emily sat frozen, the coffee cooling between her hands. "And you came back to destroy my father?" Ethan studied her. Not just him, the entire facade he built. Cedar Creek deserves the truth, and my father deserves justice. Meanwhile, Daniel, the eldest Reynolds brother, was in Charlotte pushing a higher seat at his law firm. He hated coming back to Cedar Creek, but Charles summoned him often. Charles demanded Daniel eventually move home and take the helm. Daniel, however, wasn't loyal. He was calculating. To him, Cedar Creek was suffocating, a prison of his father's making. His exit strategy was already forming. When a rumor reached him that Ethan Cole was back in town, asking about Richard, Daniel didn't tell his father. Instead, he secretly tracked Ethan down one evening outside the library. "You're stirring ghosts best left buried," Daniel warned coolly. "My father will crush you if he thinks you're sniffing around." But Ethan only smiled faintly. "Maybe your father isn't the only one who deserves to fall." Daniel tilted his head, intrigued. He saw something in Ethan, a dangerous ally, or perhaps a weapon he could use. Of the Reynolds children, Michael was hardest to read. He lived at the old family property, tending to his father's projects, haunted daily by nightmares from Afghanistan. He was close to his mother, who begged him to leave Cedar Creek, but guilt chained him down. Michael was the only one who remembered the night Richard died clearly. He had been 8 years old, sitting on the porch when he heard raised voices in the barn, his father's roar, his uncle's desperate tone. Later, he'd seen Charles return, jaw tight, smelling of oil. Hours later, police lights flared red and blue through the trees. He had never spoken of it to anyone, but when Ethan ran into him one afternoon at the Veterans Center, Michael felt the weight of his silence crack. Ethan shook his hand firmly, looked him dead in the eye, and Michael, for one strange moment, thought he saw his Uncle Richard's reflection. Cedar Creek began buzzing. Ethan's presence stirred more than family grudges. Older townsfolk remembered Charles buying out Richard's land for far too little. Farmers whispered about signed agreements that never saw daylight. The sheriff, a longtime hunting buddy of Charles, started warning Ethan to let the past be the past. Rather than back down, Ethan leaned into the whispers. He met people, listened to their stories, collected receipts. Every coffee shared, every handshake became another thread in the net he was weaving. Emily felt herself changing. Each piece of evidence Ethan revealed pulled her further from loyalty to her father and closer to him. She found herself sneaking phone calls with Ethan late at night, whispering in the dark, the forbidden truth both terrifying and thrilling. But one evening, Charles caught her looking at the forged contracts again. "What are you doing with those papers?" His voice was dangerously calm. Emily stammered, "I was just curious." Charles grabbed her wrist sharply. "Curiosity killed more than cats, Emily. Don't forget who feeds this family." She pulled away, her eyes blazing, for the first time not cowering, and Charles noticed. The chessboard was set. Ethan had Emily's trust. Daniel was undecided but considering betrayal of his own father. Michael carried guilty truths that could shatter the family forever. And Charles, powerful, proud, ruthless, still underestimated how deep his sins ran. Ethan knew the storm was building, and storms always began with whispers before the thunder. Ethan knew that revenge wasn't chaos, it was strategy. He had waited years for this. His first target wasn't Charles directly, but the empire he had built, the Reynolds Construction Company. He discovered that several contracts for county projects were tied to falsified environmental reports. If exposed, not only would Charles lose credibility, but the county could file legal action. Late into summer nights, Ethan sat at his mother's old desk with piles of documents spread out like battle maps. Emily helped him photograph files she'd stolen from her father's office, scanning them into Ethan's laptop. She felt the thrill of betrayal, the line between loyalty and justice already erased. "Strike the business first," Ethan told her. "Cut his power, then we go for him." Through a contact in Raleigh, Ethan leaked documents to a local investigative journalist, pretending to be an anonymous whistleblower inside Reynolds Construction. Within 2 weeks, Cedar Creek's calm evenings were shaken by headlines.
The words spread faster than wildfire. People stopped Charles in church parking lots, muttering questions he waved off angrily. "This is nothing but slander," Charles barked at the town council. "I've built this community with my own 2 hands. Don't forget that." But public doubt had begun. Ethan smiled quietly to himself. Daniel drove down from Charlotte after the articles hit. At the Reynolds family estate, he watched his father storm across the foyer, shouting into the phone, threatening lawsuits, firing advisors. Daniel realized what Ethan was doing, and it impressed him. If Reynolds Construction fell, Charles's fortune, reputation, and control over his children would crumble, and Daniel wanted that. One evening, Daniel met Ethan again, this time not as an enemy. "You're smart," Daniel admitted. "You know where to cut. My father bleeds money, not just pride. Push harder, hit his contracts. I can give you access to his financial records. In exchange, I want out clean. When he falls, I don't want to go down with him." He studied him. "You're helping because you hate him?" Daniel smirked. "Because I hate losing, and Charles Reynolds loses this time." And so the eldest son quietly shifted into the conspiracy against his own father. Michael, meanwhile, watched everything unfold like a man caught in a burning house. He wasn't like Daniel. He didn't hunger for Charles's fall. He wanted peace. But for years, he had carried the memory of that night Richard died, locked behind his teeth. One night at the Veterans Center, Michael broke. He spoke to an old Marine friend, his voice trembling. "My father killed my uncle. I know he did. I saw him that night. I was just a boy, but I remember his hands, his face, and I said nothing all these years." The confession didn't stay private. By the weekend, word reached Cedar Creek's rumor mill. Charles heard the whispers, heard that his own son had spoken. Fury raged inside him. During dinner, he slammed his fist down on the table. "Michael, what lies have you been spreading?" Michael stared at him, silent, his eyes hollow. For the first time, Charles didn't see obedience in his son, only contempt. Emily grew closer to Ethan. Their alliance steeped not only in evidence, but in something she hadn't expected: affection. Long nights turned into quiet walks by the lakeside, where she found herself holding his hand despite the echo of their forbidden bloodlines. "Do you ever worry it's wrong?" she asked him once, gazing at the rippling water. Ethan hesitated, then whispered, "What Charles did was wrong. Loving the truth, loving someone who sees it, can't be." For Emily, it was no longer just about justice. It was about building something new, free from her father's shadow. But Charles Reynolds was no fool. He had survived decades by smelling betrayal before it reached his door. Hiring a private investigator, he put Ethan under surveillance. Photographs soon revealed Emily meeting Ethan at odd hours, Daniel sneaking files into briefcases, Michael visiting the Veterans Center too often. Charles finally saw it. The cracks in his fortress were not made by strangers, but by his own blood. "This family eats because of me," he roared at Martha one night, "and this family will die before it betrays me." But deep down, Charles knew. It was already too late. The war had begun, and for the first time in his life, he was not the hunter. He was the prey. The investigation into Reynolds' construction deepened rapidly. State auditors arrived in Cedar Creek, combing through county records, examining land deeds, uncovering more and more hidden cracks. Projects that once stood as Charles's pride were suddenly labeled under review. Loans stopped. Investors backed away. For a man who thrived on control, Charles was watching his empire slip like sand through clenched fists, and he knew someone was feeding the fire. At home, dinner became war. Daniel argued openly with his father, Emily barely spoke at all, and Michael avoided the table completely. Martha tried to keep peace, but her soft words were ignored. "This family is dying, and it's because one of you brought the disease inside," he hissed one night, his eyes circling the table like a predator. No one answered, and Charles realized silence had become rebellion. Ethan escalated. Meeting Daniel and Emily at the old Creekside barn, ironically the same place where Richard had confronted Charles decades ago, he showed them photographs and reports he had quietly collected. "Look at this. Brake fluid residue on my father's truck, pulled from police archives." The report dismissed it as old damage, but the truth is clear. The brake line was cut. That wasn't an accident. It was murder. Emily's hands trembled as she looked at the papers. Daniel's jaw tightened. "We leak this?" Daniel asked. "No," Ethan said firmly. "Not yet. This isn't just about the law. This is about making Charles watch his entire house of lies collapse before we drive in the final stake." For the first time, Daniel smirked at Ethan. Not at Ethan, but in admiration. "You're colder than I thought," he admitted. "I like it." Michael couldn't stay out of it anymore. He confronted Ethan privately one evening. "You think exposing him will fix this? My father isn't just cruel, he's dangerous. When he learns the truth, he won't just fight back in business. He'll come for you, and maybe for us too." Ethan looked at him steadily. "Then you have a choice to make. Keep letting him live like nothing happened, or stand for your uncle." Michael's voice cracked. "I was there, Ethan. I heard Richard begging. I heard my father say, 'You'll sign or you'll bleed.' And then silence. I never told anyone. I was just a kid, but I knew." Those words shattered something inside him. Ethan placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then you're the witness. You're the one who can end him." Michael wept quietly for the first time in years. Sensing betrayal tightening around him, Charles lashed out violently, not with fists, but with power. One morning, Emily found her bank accounts frozen. Daniel's job applications for higher positions in Charlotte mysteriously blackballed through whispered phone calls. Michael discovered his veteran benefits suddenly delayed by clerical error, courtesy of someone with strings in the system. Charles was striking back, cutting off his children's independence, tightening the leash. "This family eats because of me," he declared, "and you'll learn what happens to the ungrateful." But instead of regaining control, he drove them further away. The tension finally boiled into violence. One night, after drinking too much bourbon, Charles confronted Michael in the barn. "You embarrassed me. You told your lies in town. Do you think anyone will believe a broken soldier like you over me?" Michael stared at him, silent, fists trembling. "I should have taught you respect when you were younger. Maybe now's the time." Michael snapped. Years of rage and guilt and silence exploded. He shoved Charles hard against the wall, fists flying. Charles swung back. For minutes, father and son brawled in the dust, rage against rage, blood against blood. When Martha and Emily arrived at the barn, breathless from hearing the shouts, they found Michael standing over Charles, blood dripping from his knuckles while Charles slumped against the wall, bruised but snarling. "You're not my father anymore," Michael said, voice shaking. "You're just a monster I should have stopped long ago." Charles's grin, twisted despite the pain, chilled everyone. "You think you can replace me? This family is mine. You'll see. You all will see." From a distance, Ethan observed. His plan hadn't required violence yet, but now the family itself was burning from within. He knew then the moment was close. "All wars," he wrote in his notebook, "end not when enemies are struck, but when they turn on each other, and the Reynolds family has begun its own war." By autumn, the county probe into Reynolds' construction had shifted from routine review into full-blown investigation. Court subpoenas began arriving at the house, documents demanding Charles's full accounts, contracts, and tax filings. Charles tried his old tricks: bribes to officials, veiled threats through lawyers, whispered deals in hotel bars. But Ethan's leaks had already seeded doubt so deeply that the authorities couldn't ignore it anymore. Everything Charles touched was under suspicion now. The Reynolds home no longer felt like a mansion. It felt like a bunker. Doors slammed. Dinners ended in shouting. Servants quietly quit. And Emily, Daniel, and Michael each drifted further from their father, united less by blood than by resentment. For years, Daniel had hidden his bitterness under layers of professional calm, but one night, Charles, furious after another subpoena, confronted him directly. "You're the lawyer in this family. Fix this disaster. Make this investigation disappear." Daniel, sipping quietly from a glass of whiskey, finally let out what he'd kept inside for decades. "I spent my life cleaning up your messes, pretending you were a man of honor when I knew you were a thief. I'm not fixing it this time." Charles turned, eyes blazing. "Without me, you're nothing." Daniel smiled bitterly. "Without you, I might finally be free." It was the first time Charles realized his eldest son was no longer afraid. Meanwhile, Emily found herself unable to resist the pull toward Ethan. More than a co-conspirator, he became her confidant. They spent nights driving the back roads of Cedar Creek, talking about the future. "Do you ever wonder if revenge changes us?" Emily asked one evening, headlights cutting through mist. "It doesn't change us. It shows us who we really were, all along." When she looked at him, she didn't just see her cousin. She saw a man carrying justice like a torch, and to her surprise, that flame warmed her too. Their bond, unspoken but undeniable, created a dangerous complication, because if Charles discovered it, he would unleash wrath not only on Ethan, but on his own daughter. Michael, quieter but restless, finally admitted what Ethan had long believed. He could testify. He sat across from Ethan in the barn one cold evening, his hands trembling.
I was 8 years old, but I remember it. I remember Uncle Richard's voice begging. I remember my father storming out, his hands shaking, his shirt stained with oil. I remember hearing the truck engine start, then hours later, sirens. He forced himself to look Ethan in the eyes. I'll say it in court. I'll say it to the world. For Ethan, those words were a turning point. He knew then the day of reckoning was close. But Charles had not survived decades in Cedar Creek without learning how to fight when cornered. Hiring a ruthless attorney from Atlanta, he planned his counterstrike. He quietly began spreading rumors about his own children, calling Daniel corrupt, Michael unstable, Emily immoral. He even hinted to old allies that Ethan's return was not about truth, but about money. Soon, half the town buzzed with conflicting stories, and though his power was slipping, Charles still had influence over newspapers, sheriffs, and pastors who owed him favors. At the same time, Charles's investigator uncovered proof of Emily's secret meetings with Ethan and their growing closeness. "This girl is going to destroy herself," Charles muttered coldly, gripping the photographs, "and I'll make sure of it if she doesn't fall back in line." The breaking point came during one thunderstorm in October. Gathered reluctantly in the dining room, the family endured another of Charles's tirades. But this time, each child answered back. "You've ruined us," Daniel spat. "You've been lying my whole life," Emily added. And finally, Michael, shaking, whispered something that hit like a gunshot. "You killed Uncle Richard. I saw you that night." The room went silent except for thunder. Martha gasped and pressed her hands to her mouth. Charles's face, red, twisted, seemed almost volcanic, but for the first time he had no words. The silence confirmed everything. Outside in his car, Ethan sat in the rain, watching the house lights flicker as the storm raged. He didn't need to be inside to know what was happening. The cracks had become fractures. The family was no longer a fortress, it was rubble waiting to collapse. He wrote again in his notebook, "The truth isn't enough. Truth must be paired with ruin. Tomorrow, I strike the heart." Winter came early to Cedar Creek, but the chill in the air wasn't just weather, it was the county grand jury. After weeks of review, subpoenas, and testimony, Charles Reynolds was officially indicted on multiple counts of fraud, forgery, and corruption. The news exploded across local headlines. A man once praised as Cedar Creek's builder was now branded as its parasite. Protesters stood outside the courthouse holding signs, some reading "Justice for Richard" and others "Reynolds lied." Inside the Reynolds mansion, Charles hurled a glass across the wall when the sheriff delivered papers. "They'll regret this," he snarled through clenched teeth, "every one of them." But beneath his rage was something unfamiliar to him, fear. Ethan worked tirelessly to prepare. His research had gathered weight, but the crown jewel was Michael's decision to testify. "You'll swear under oath. This isn't just about whispers anymore. The town will hear your words." Michael nodded. Though tormented, his back seemed straighter, his eyes clearer. "For Uncle Richard. For me. It's time." Emily, too, agreed to provide supporting documents she had taken from the attic. Those contracts, the forged signature, proof enough to call Charles a thief. Daniel, legally sharp, secretly coached Ethan on how to handle depositions and filings, though he kept his role quiet to protect his career. The children Charles had controlled like chess pieces for decades were now united against him. But Charles Reynolds was not a man who surrendered. His Atlanta attorney crafted a counter-narrative. Michael was unstable and prone to hallucinations. Emily was emotionally manipulated by Ethan, whom Charles painted as a bitter, money-grubbing outsider. Daniel was too ambitious to care for truth. In small-town churches, Charles whispered lies about Ethan, hinting he was romantically entangled with his cousin, twisting their closeness into scandal. In taverns, he suggested Michael's PTSD made him untrustworthy. He even tried to convince Martha to side with him, reminding her of all the years of comfort he had given her.
But Martha, broken after decades of silence, muttered softly, "Comfort built on blood isn't comfort." It was the first time she'd stood against him, even in words, and her defiance shattered Charles more than he showed. The first day in court was electric. Reporters busied themselves in the aisles. Townsfolk crowded benches to watch their titan fall. Ethan sat behind the prosecution, taking notes. When Michael walked to the witness stand, Cedar Creek held its breath. Hands trembling slightly, Michael took the oath and began. "I was only 8, but I remember it as if it was yesterday. My father and my uncle were in the barn. I heard shouting, saw papers on the table. My uncle refused to sign. My father threatened him, then hours later, my uncle was dead. His truck's brakes were cut." Gasps filled the room. Charles leaned forward, face stone. His attorney objected furiously, shouting about childhood memory and unreliable testimony. But the damage was done. Inside the courthouse, a truth long buried was finally spoken aloud. Cedar Creek could never unhear it.
To strengthen the case, Ethan submitted his years of evidence: bank transfers, suspicious land deeds, falsified reports. But Charles's lawyer countered with venom. "Mr. Cole has one motive: revenge. Isn't it true you've hated Charles Reynolds since childhood? Isn't it true you returned only to destroy his name?" Ethan glanced toward the jury, then spoke plainly. "Yes, I hate him because he murdered my father and built his empire on theft. But my hate doesn't change the facts. The documents don't hate, the signatures don't hate, the money trails don't hate. They tell the story on their own." It was a gamble, admitting personal bias, but one that resonated. Jurors exchanged glances. A man motivated by revenge could be dismissed, but facts had their own weight. When Emily testified, she described the attic, the contracts, the fear she lived under for years. But under cross-examination, Charles's lawyer pounced. "You've been meeting with Ethan secretly, haven't you? You've grown close to him, yes?" Emily's face flushed crimson. Whispers filled the courtroom. The insinuation of forbidden love spread like oil on water. Charles smirked across the aisle, pleased with the wound. But Emily didn't waver. She raised her chin and answered coldly, "Yes, I love him, and maybe that's wrong in your eyes, but it doesn't make those papers forged by anyone other than my father. Love doesn't forge contracts. My father did." The courtroom buzzed again, but this time with admiration. Emily's courage turned the scandal into a moment of defiance. The trial dragged for weeks. Each day, Charles walked in with less bravado, his suits duller, his expression darker. He was losing, and he knew it. At night, in his empty mansion, he wandered hallways alone, muttering to himself, staring at the portraits of his family that once symbolized loyalty, but now only reminded him of betrayal. "Snakes," he hissed, "all of them. My blood turned to poison." His rage grew dangerous. Investigators began receiving anonymous complaints that Ethan's car had been followed on dark roads, that Michael was nearly hit by a truck in a parking lot, that Emily's tires were slashed. No evidence tied it directly to Charles, but everyone suspected. The predator was cornered, lashing out blindly, but cornered yet. By the end of December, both prosecution and defense rested. The closing arguments burned the courtroom like fire. The prosecutor stood tall and thundered. "This is not the story of a successful man unfairly accused. This is the story of a murderer, a thief, and a liar who believed power was above justice. But in Cedar Creek, justice rises, sooner or later." Charles's lawyer fought with everything, painting the family as bitter, broken, manipulated. "A vendetta," he thundered. "A family feud twisted into false memories." When the jury disappeared into deliberation, the entire town held its breath. Hours passed, then a night, then another. And on the third morning, the whispers began. A verdict is coming. The courthouse in Cedar Creek felt less like a room of justice and more like a stage for something ancient.
Retribution, fate, the breaking of bloodlines. Entire families from town crowded the benches, waiting.
The jury filed in, faces grim and unreadable. Charles sat stiff, his once proud shoulders squared, but sweat glistening at his temple. Ethan's pulse hammered in his ears as he gripped the rail behind the prosecution. Emily stared at the floor, lips pressed tight. Michael's hands shook in his lap. The foreman stood. On the counts of fraud, forgery, and corruption, we find the defendant, Charles Reynolds, guilty. The words did not echo, they slammed. Gasps burst from the gallery, whispers swarmed the air. Charles closed his eyes, jaw clenching. The judge's gavel struck. Sentencing would come later, but the verdict was final. The empire of Charles Reynolds was finished. But for a man like Charles, defeat was not enough. Inside that courtroom collapse blossomed not humility, but hate. As deputies approached, Charles erupted. His voice thundered. "You think this is justice? No, this is vengeance writ by liars, by traitors in my own home." He turned on Ethan. His face twisted into something feral. "And you, I should have finished you with your father. You are nothing but his bitter shadow." The deputies restrained him, but the outburst scarred the air. The mask of the benefactor was gone. Cedar Creek saw Charles Reynolds for what he was, a tyrant unmasked at last. Through the chaos, a softer voice rose. Martha Reynolds, long silent, stood in the gallery, her posture frail, but her voice sharp. "For 30 years, I lived beside a man I knew was guilty. I held my tongue while he buried my brother-in-law, while he poisoned our children with fear. But today, I won't be silent." The courtroom hushed. "My children are free of you, and at last, I am too." It was not part of the trial, not evidence, but it was liberation spoken aloud. Outside, reporters swarmed Ethan. Flashbulbs popped, microphones shoved forward. How does it feel? What's next? But Ethan felt no triumph. Standing under the gray winter sky, he realized revenge didn't fill the emptiness where his father should have been. Richard was still gone. His mother had lived a life of quiet pain. And Ethan himself, he had sacrificed years to this moment. Emily approached him, slipping her hand into his. For a moment, it steadied him. "You gave him justice," she whispered. Ethan shook his head. "Justice costs too much sometimes. It burns the hand that carries it." Back in Charlotte, Daniel used the storm to climb higher. He positioned himself as the lawyer who helped dismantle corruption, distancing himself publicly from his father. But in the mirror each night, he saw something familiar. The glint of cunning in his own eyes that reminded him of Charles. Revenge had freed him, but it had also made him realize he was his father's son in ambition, if not in loyalty. A revelation that chilled him more than his courtroom victories. Michael became Cedar Creek's reluctant hero. People shook his hand, calling him brave. For the first time, he didn't shrink from the attention. He walked straighter in town. The weight of silence lifted. But nights were harder. The dreams returned. The barn, the shouting, the crash of the truck. Only now, when he woke, he wasn't silent anymore. He spoke his memories aloud. And in speaking, he began, slowly, to heal. For Emily and Ethan, the verdict bound them together in a storm of affection, secrecy, and danger. Their love was undeniable, but also a shadow hanging over them. Some neighbors whispered, others turned away. One night by Cedar Creek itself, Emily asked softly, "Do we keep running from this? From who we are to each other?" Ethan looked over the dark water, the same creek where his father died. "Maybe we don't run. Maybe we build something new from the ashes, something he can't touch." They both knew Cedar Creek wouldn't forgive them easily, but they didn't care. From his jail cell awaiting sentencing, Charles Reynolds sat alone. Guards spoke of him muttering endlessly, repeating the same vow. "This isn't over. Blood always circles back. My children can't erase me. One day, they'll see." Whether the threat was madness or promise, no one knew. But Ethan, Emily, Michael, Daniel, and Martha, each of them, carried scars deep enough to know that the echo of Charles Reynolds would never fully die. Time is merciless, even after victory. Justice came with the guilty verdict, but vengeance left its scars. The Reynolds mansion still stood at the edge of town, but its windows were dark, its gardens overgrown. Locals called it the Husk, a relic of a dynasty rotted from within. Children dared each other to step on its porch at Halloween, whispering about the ghost of Charles Reynolds. Inside Cedar Creek, though, life moved on. The town no longer defined itself by the Reynolds name. They spoke instead of survival, of lessons learned about greed, corruption, and silence. Daniel left Cedar Creek permanently. Using the notoriety of the trial, he rose in Charlotte as a politician, positioning himself as fighter of corruption. Behind speeches and charm, however, lay ambition sharp as his father's. But some nights, when accolades were loudest, Daniel found himself sitting alone, staring at his reflection, fearful of how much of Charles lived inside him still. Success never silenced the question he carried. Am I free? Or am I simply repeating him under another mask? Michael remained in Cedar Creek, but not in bitterness. Instead, he turned tragedy into service. He volunteered with veterans, counseling them through trauma, teaching them that silence only deepened the wound. People began calling him the heart of Cedar Creek. And though nightmares still woke him, he had something he never thought possible: peace in speaking aloud. When asked why he stayed when he could have fled like his siblings, he smiled. Because sometimes the only way to beat the shadows is to keep lighting the same place again and again. Emily and Ethan dared what many still whispered against. They built a life together. Moving to Asheville, they opened a small bookstore cafe, naming it the Cedar House. It became a quiet haven for students, poets, and misfits. To most, they were simply partners in business. To those who knew the truth, they were a reminder that love rarely fits rules. At times, glares followed them. But Ethan, carrying his father's memory and his long road of justice, only held Emily's hand tighter. "Let them look," he'd say softly. "We lived in secret too long. Now we live free." Their bond, born in vengeance, was tested by society's judgment. But unlike Charles's iron grip, their love was built on choice, not fear. Martha never remarried. She moved into a small home near the church, filling her days with gardening and volunteering for families in need. Neighbors often remarked that she seemed lighter than when she lived under Charles's rule. One spring morning, she was found quietly tending roses, humming a hymn. A woman who had endured decades of silence had at last found her voice, even in simple peace. Charles Reynolds died 5 years into his prison sentence, heart failure in a cold cell. Few attended his funeral, a scattering of old business acquaintances, one distant cousin, and not a single family member. On his gravestone was etched only Charles Reynolds, 1962 to 2029. No beloved husband, no father, no remembered legacy. In Cedar Creek, his name became less of a curse and more of a cautionary tale. Ambition without conscience devours even its own blood. Years later, sitting in his bookstore after closing, Ethan opened the battered notebook he'd carried since his father's death. Inside were pages of plans, evidence, and his vow: "I will not rest until Charles Reynolds falls." But as he closed it, he realized he no longer needed it. The war was over. Revenge had been his compass for so long, but now
Now there was life left to live. He placed the notebook on a back shelf and left it there, a relic of blood and fire. Then, taking Emily's hand, he whispered, "We're not the ashes anymore. We're the beginning." The saga of the Reynolds family stretched across decades, weaving power, betrayal, silence, and revenge into one relentless storm. But revenge never ends with victory. It leaves echoes, in shadows, in whispers, in choices weighed every day by those who survived. Cedar Creek, scarred but breathing, learned that even in small towns with painted smiles, evil can rot the roots. But truth, once voiced, can grow back stronger. The family of Charles Reynolds had been torn apart, yet in their ruin, they found what Charles never grasped: freedom.